Welcome again. Oh, I can move my banner because I started. This program has I can put these little things, and they're fun. Yeah, so welcome to Embroidery Primer with Sarah. So I usually do every couple months intro to embroidery class, and this is going to be sort of a baby version of that, so you can follow along. I also have some more up close videos of a lot of these stitches on our website at crafthabitraleigh.com. We've got a how-to page. We're just going to go through some stuff today. If you've got supplies, I hope that you will stitch along with me. And yeah, post your comments. I'm going to stay on comments so I can see comments. Hi, Carla. Oh, hi. Is that Phoebe? Hi, guys. I wish I could see you too. But I'm so glad you're tuned in. So yeah, I'm going to get started. I made myself some little notes so I remember what to say. I also am going to have a hard time looking at the camera, so just know that I'm here with you. So yeah, so I'll kind of start with what is embroidery. Hi, Joanna. Welcome. So embroidery can sometimes be a pretty big term to encompass a lot of different things you can do with needle and thread. But when I talk about embroidery, I basically mean stitching on any kind of fabric with embroidery floss. So you can stitch on cotton, you can stitch on denim, you can stitch on linen, whatever you want. The thing about embroidery is it's very free form, it's very improvisational. The biggest contrast is to cross stitch, which if you're familiar with cross stitch, it's got a fabric with a loose weave that's really gridded, and it's almost like you're stitching in little squares. And so that's why everything comes out very pixelated, and it can be very beautiful. But embroidery is not that. Embroidery has fewer restrictions, which I love. Some people don't. But yeah, I like that you can just stitch on anything. So I'm going to talk about some of the materials you need. I've got a bunch of stuff here. These are just little samples. We have kits of all of these. This is a little snake plant and a mountain and some bananas. These are some of my favorites. And a unicorn, because you got to have a unicorn. So those are just some samples to entice you. But then the rest of my stuff here, I've got some embroidery floss. This is a really big spool of it. You usually get it in a smaller skein unless you're like me and you get huge spools. I've got my favorite scissors. These are really sharp on the tip, which makes them great for embroidery because a lot of times you're making really small cuts, and they've got a little spring action. These are sort of good all-purpose scissors, except not for cutting big things. But I love these. We call these pom-pom scissors because they're good for pom-poms too. And I think I'm going to do a pom-pom class craft along later in the month, so you'll see these babies again. I've got my embroidery hoop. This is a wooden hoop. This is a style that has a you did cross stitch with Nana? Oh, that's good. I think Nana might be watching too at some point. But this is an embroidery hoop where you can use for cross stitch also, and you can twist the little screw there, and then the middle part pops out. So you've got a solid ring like this, and then you've got another ring that's got a little bit of a, okay, there's my camera. There it is. It'll move a little bit. So that's two parts. These come in lots of different sizes. There are other styles of embroidery hoop as well, but I think this is the most common one, and it's pretty easy to use. I've got needles here. I've just got a little pin cushion I made, but I've got my embroidery needles, and they are pre-threaded because I'm cheating, but I will talk about how to thread needles too. And I swear that throughout this video, I'm going to get better at getting the camera angle right. Maybe I will practice at least. And then fabric. So today I'm going to use, this is just white cotton muslin. It's a really basic cotton woven fabric. This one has a pretty loose weave. That means there's more space microscopically in between the fibers, which means it's going to be pretty easy for me to stitch through. A looser weave fabric is easy to stitch through. A tighter weave fabric is harder, but you can use different size needles. Since we're doing some sort of beginner stuff today, I'm going to use a fabric that is loose so I can use bigger needles. But then, hi, Mom, Nana. But yeah, you can use all sorts of different fabric. And basically what I say is choose your fabric first and then find the needle that's going to work with it. Because you shouldn't feel like you can't do it just because your needle's the wrong size. Needles are fairly inexpensive and pretty easy to get. So yeah, so we're going to do some cotton today. I'm going to start just by drawing some lines on my fabric. One thing I like about cotton muslin is you can draw all over it with pencil. And then when you stitch, it's pretty much going to cover it up. So let's see, I need to go this way to get centered. So I'm just going to draw some lines today. I'm just going to do my sample stitches and lines for you, but you don't have to draw lines. You can just stitch wherever you want to. If you have a pattern that you're working on, you can do these stitches on any line in the pattern, or you can just sort of stitch randomly, improvisationally, wherever you want to. Let's see, I've got 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. That seems good. And then I'll go ahead and show you how to do your embroidery hoop. So I showed you this before. We've got the 2 pieces. I generally don't ever take this screw all the way out. I just loosen it enough so I can push that middle part with my thumbs and it comes out. Then you're going to make a sandwich like this. Your middle hoop goes down on the table. Your fabric goes on top. And I like to do it with my printed pattern on the top side. Some people will stitch the other way. I think for me, it's easiest to stitch right on top, looking at my lines. And the nice thing is these lines are thin enough that once I stitch over it with my embroidery floss, which is fairly thick, it's going to cover them up. So I'm not worried about needing to erase them later or anything. They're pretty much going to get covered up and fade in. All right, so I've got my solid hoop on the bottom, my fabric in the middle, and then I'm going to take the hoop part that has the screw in it, and I'm going to see how close I can get. So if you see here, I can sort of move that because I've got a little bit of space along that thread. Hi, Brittany, thanks. And then so you just sort of, I like to squeeze this as far open as it will go, and then put it down over top and press. And it'll fit, and it can take some work. I'm just very, very good at it. I do this a lot. But if you feel like it's not working, you can always loosen your screw a little bit more so you can pull that farther and get it on. And what you want is you want your fabric to be pretty taut so that when you tap on it, it'll bounce back. You might even hear like a little sort of drummy noise. And to get that, so you've got it on, you're going to tighten the screw. I like to tighten it just enough so I've got that sort of bounce back. And then another way to tighten it is to turn it over with your fabric and sort of tug your fabric corners towards the middle. That's also going to help tighten it in your hoop. And the reason that I don't tighten this as far as it will go is that while you are stitching and you're sort of pulling in and out of the fabric's going to loosen up as you work. So it's nice to have a little bit of give left in your screw so you can tighten it as you're going. So you can do that. And then also, again, that sort of fabric tugging trick will work as well. What you don't want is you don't want to see as you're stitching a lot of sort of like dips in your fabric, because the looser your fabric is, the harder it makes it harder to stitch. When you've got a little bit of resistance here, it actually makes it easier. So as you're going along, if you start to see that your fabric starts to sort of sag and dip, just go in there, pull your edges, and that'll tighten it up. All right, so that's the easy part. The hard part is threading needles. So we're going to do a little bit of needle threading. I did, pre-thread a bunch of mine before, so I can get through this more quickly, and we'll take some time too. You can pre-thread. I don't know if you can pause a live video, but if you want to pause it and thread some stuff, you can do that and then catch up. And I'm pretty sure this will be saved on the internet, so you can go back and look again. But so I'm going to talk about embroidery needles first. So embroidery needles are sized such that the smaller the number, the larger the needle. So a size 1 needle is going to be a lot bigger than a size 10 needle. And if you got the little kit today, I put in these DMC needles that are size 1, 3, and 5. So these are pretty good big size needles. We also carry Tulip brand embroidery needles, which are very nice. And this is the large size too. This is 3, 4, 5, and 6. So these are larger. Larger is going to mean that it's not just a bigger eye, but it's going to be a thicker needle and a little bit longer. There's not a whole lot of difference in the length, but like in here, the number 1 needle is definitely the longest and the thickest. And it's got the biggest eye. So I'm going to pop this out and show you. The tough thing is once you take it out of the case, you do not have a record of what size these are. So, and it's not written anywhere. So you just kind of have to like get used to different sizes and guessing. But here, this is the biggest one. So this is the number 1 needle. And I'm going to see if I can get really close to the camera. And so you can maybe see the eye in there. And if you have needles at home, just look at your own needles because that's way easier than this. So you've got the eye of the needle, and it is long and skinny. I'm going to draw a little sketch down here and see if this works. So like, if that's an embroidery needle, then the eye is right here. It's long and skinny. Whereas usually with a sewing needle, your eye is going to be more round. Sorry, you can't see that, but long and skinny. Oh, and here I did bring some props. This is my Miss Frizzle moment where we're going to pretend that like we are diving deeply into the microscopic world. So let's pretend that my gold needle just zoomed in and turned into this purple needle. So this is a yarn needle, but it's the same kind of shape and dimensions as an embroidery needle. And you can see that its eye is long and narrow. And let's pretend that this macrame cord is actually embroidery floss. So this is going to be this stuff. And if you can see the end of the embroidery floss, the macrame cord, it is a bunch of different strands, and they are twisted together and they make a round shape. So a round shape going at a long skinny shape is difficult. Oh my God, so is finding the camera. There we go. Whew. All right. So if I want this to fit into here, the best thing to do is to make this a different shape. And since all these little threads are together, oh my God, there we go. If I squish them with my fingers, they go from round to flat. So you can see it's really flat between my fingers. And what I can do now is take this needle. Let's see if I can do this way. And I'm just going to lower the needle over those threads. So if you see that, now you've got the shape is a little more the same. So the shape of your thread is the same as the shape of your eye of your needle. And then what I'm doing, I keep this pinched, and this is the same way I do actual embroidery floss. I keep this pinched as tight as I can between my finger. Okay, camera is there. Okay, sorry, this is like in mirror. Anyway, and then lower that eye of the needle over the floss and then kind of push through. So that's what's going to happen with your embroidery needle, just on a much smaller scale. Even the size 1 needles are still a lot smaller than this handy thing. But I'll do the best I can on a demo with the tiny one. So let's see. So here's some pink embroidery floss. And again, I'm going to pull that down and squish it between my fingers. So small. And then I'm going to take my needle and lower it over that. And I'm just pushing a little bit through. As soon as I see a little bit of that come through, then I grab it and pull. So that's the best trick that I can tell you. The fact is that like you just kind of need to practice. You need to figure out what works with your hand mechanics. You might not be real comfortable with a pincher grip like this, and that might be a different way you do it. That is totally fine. That's just sort of step by step how I do it. And this is threading all 6 strands. So in this cotton embroidery floss, which is what we're using today, it's 6-strand embroidery floss. So it's made of different pieces. Sometimes when you thread, 1 or 2 of them don't go through, and that's fine. Honestly, like unless you have some reason you need all 6, if a couple stick out, that's fine. Just pull them off. So to show you, this one's kind of starting to spread out anyway. There are a bunch of little strands here, and you don't have to use all of them. You can pull some of them off. And I'll tell you really quick about separating thread. It is always very tempting to, let me get this one, to separate your thread, what I call the string cheese method, which is just to sort of grab it and then pull like this. Sometimes that works. It worked right now because I didn't want it to. But when your thread is longer than this is only about 12 inches of thread. When you've got more thread than this and you pull it apart, just sort of both sides opposite each other, a lot of times what happens is it tangles up on itself and ties a big knot. So if you want to avoid that, the other method that is more reliable, I call it the inchworm method. You would grab out however many strands you want to do. I'm just going to do one at a time. So I'm just separating one strand right here, and I'm going to hold the 4 or 5 strands that I'm keeping, and this one here that's starting to untwist, I'm just going to sort of gently pull it down, and then I'm going to pull it some more. I'm going to pull it some more. This is why it's, I'm so sorry about how I don't know where this camera is. This is the inchworm method because it's kind of coming off one bit at a time. And there are probably some more clear videos of this out there, but that's separating your strands. So if you're having a really hard time threading your needle, just go ahead and separate your strands from the beginning. It's fine. You know, whatever you make is for you. And if you like it, then you should do it that way. That's one of the things that's really hard about an intro to embroidery class is that the actual embroidery steps are nowhere near as hard as threading embroidery needles for the first time. So I will tell you what I tell all of my students, both virtual and in person. It just takes practice. It just takes practice. In my classes, I thread needles for people all the time. I'm sorry I can't do that for you today. Hopefully there's someone very dexterous in your life who can help, but if not, remember you can separate your threads. You could embroider with other stuff if you wanted to as well. But yeah, to make it easiest, you want to find the biggest needle you can and the smallest thread you can. And I should go back and say that one of the reasons it is hard is because when you're threading an embroidery needle, you do want to fit as many strands in the eye as will fit. So that's why it's hard, because you're putting a lot of thread through a small spot. But the nice thing is when you do that, when you have your needle threaded with as much thread as possible, it's not going to come unthreaded. Like, it takes a lot. I'm sort of pulling on this. It's not going to come out of the needle unless you pull really hard. So that's a nice thing, is you don't have to worry about, like, if you're holding it like this, your needle's not going to slip off. Anyway, but I have got pre-threaded needles because I'm a cheater and I'm prepared. So we've got our hoop ready, and I've got some needles threaded. Oh, Erin, yes, why to separate strands? So there's a few reasons. So one reason to separate your strands of your floss is, like I just said, to make it easier to thread into your needle. Another thing is that if you are working with a tighter weave fabric means you're gonna have to use a smaller needle to get through there. And the smaller your needle, the less thread's gonna fit in it. So that's another reason you would separate strands. And then the third reason is that you can just make different textures with different types of strands. I'm going to grab an example. So this is one of our kits. It's a little bee design. It's really fun. It takes a while to stitch, but it's really nice. And I'm going to get close up here to show you the wings. So on these wings, I've done the same type of stitch all the way around, but I did about, on the outer edges of the wing, I did 3 strands. And then the inner little veins in there, I just did 1 strand. So what you can see is that it makes a difference to the texture. Everything else is the same. It's the same color thread. It's the same type of stitch. I just did fewer strands. And I just really like how much depth it gives it, and it's so simple because really it's all the same thing. It's just a fewer strands. So aesthetically, is another reason to separate strands. And also, just when you get frustrated and you can't thread your needle, separate your strands. It's fine. And then, this gold thread in here, this is a polyester thread, And you separate that because it wants to separate anyway. As soon as you cut that, like all the strands start to run away from each other. So that I usually separate because it's just impossible to get all 6 strands threaded in that one. So there's various reasons, both artistic and practical. You're welcome, Erin. I hope that helps. Yeah, so, all right. So we're ready to stitch, or I'm ready to stitch. I hope you're ready to stitch. And I've picked some colors today. I don't think these are the most beautiful color combination, but I wanted high contrast stuff so it would show up on this webcam. And so let's see, I'm going to start with this blue. So my needle's already threaded, and when my needle is threaded, I like to have a short tail off one side and a long tail off the other, and then I tie a knot in the end of the long tail. Just one basic knot. Just the way I do it is just going to do this. So I sort of make a loop like that, and then so this right now this is crossing over, and then I just bring that tail through the loop, so it's a little pretzel, and just pull. Just one knot like that. That's usually fine, especially if you are using all 6 strands, because 6 strands is going to be a bigger knot. If you have come down to fewer strands, you might want to knot this again, which I do the same way. It can be hard to land your second knot on top of the first one, and that is just another matter of practice. So even there, I didn't quite get it. My 2 little knots are just sort of next to each other. So if you are using fewer strands or your fabric has a looser weave than this and you want to do a bigger knot, I would just do the same method. So across the top, through the middle, but then you can just go through the middle again before you pull the knot, or even 3 times. So when you do that, you're going to end up with a much thicker knot. It will be in the same place there. Hi, Joanna. Thank you for coming in. All right, so I like to start with a knot on the end of my thread just because it's easier to remember. Some people who embroider don't do a knot at the end. They just remember not to pull their thread all the way through, and then later they will weave the ends back in, and you can certainly do that. But when I do my beginning course, we tie a knot. It's just one less thing to have to remember later. So I've tied a knot, and I'm going to start by showing you the running stitch. Let me see if I have my, yeah, this has got a sample. Oh, this has got a sample of the running stitch. So this little sloth kit, there we go, I'm gonna make this right side up. This is designed by Amy Richards, who's one of our instructors here and a local artist. These are her happy sloths. So we put this into a kit. So the heart around here is a running stitch, and don't mind the places where it is color running. That is a different issue. But just a running stitch is basically a dotted line, and it's up to you how far apart your stitches are, how big they are. But we'll just start with that. When you embroider, you are going to start from the back of your hoop. So I'm at the, I usually just put my hand back here. If you need to, you can turn it over, but then you can't see your design. So here's a trick that I like. So you're holding your hoop, you've got your needle. From behind, you can bring your needle up. Let's see if I can get close enough so you can see this. Okay, do you sort of see the tip of that needle moving around? Let's see, I'm going to do it between these 2 lines. Oh, I don't know if you can see that. Oh, maybe there. See that the line that's like closest to the bottom of the screen? Anyway, what I'm trying to say is you can press your needle up against the back of the fabric before you come all the way through so you can see where it is. So I'm going to start right here. There we go. So I'm coming through on my line. I'm going to pull my needle up. Now, right now, I still have my long tail and my short tail behind. They're still on this side, which is great. So I pull the needle through. Once I get it here, I like to pinch right there on the eye of the needle so that I am holding both pieces of thread. That way, when I pull through, I'm not going to accidentally unthread my needle. If I'm just holding the needle itself and I pull the way, what's going to happen is that short tail is going to get too short and it's going to come unthreaded. So I usually sort of get my needle through the fabric and then quickly pinch right there on the end. So I'm holding both of those strands. All right, so here's our first stitch. We came up from the back. We're going to go down through the front, and you can pick whatever size you want. I generally do bigger stitches when I'm teaching, because if you do tiny stitches, you will not finish during class. So that's it. It's up and it's down. And then your second stitch, you're just going to find a space along your design line and come up. You can leave as big a space as you want. You can make a smaller stitch. It's up to you. So running stitch is basically just up and down, up and down. Now, one thing about running stitch is that you will see your design lines in between the stitches. Here I was worried I wouldn't have enough light, but now it seems like it's too bright. Anyway, but yeah, so what I'm saying is, like, if you've, like, I've drawn a straight line here, but I'm only stitching over part of it, so the rest of my line's gonna be visible. This is where pencil is nice, because if I wanted to, I could go in afterwards and just erase the parts of the line that aren't being covered by my stitches. Or if you washed it, that pencil will come out too. But yeah, so that is a running stitch. If you're at all familiar with sashiko embroidery, sashiko is all running stitches, but they are supposed to be much more even and uniform than these are. So I definitely would not call this sashiko. But if you're doing sashiko embroidery, this basically is the stitch that you do. There is a way to do it. A sashiko embroidery needle is similar to this, but usually longer, because what you do with that is you're actually going to lay multiple stitches before you pull all the way through. So what I'm doing here is sort of weaving my needle into the fabric, and then when I pull that through, I've just made 3 stitches in one go as opposed to 1 stitch. And you can see that these are not even and not uniform, because I have not practiced my sashiko skills. And honestly, if I was doing it for real, I would probably do up and down anyway. So the way I'm stitching right now, this is called the stabbing method, because basically you are taking your needle and you're stabbing it through the fabric up and stabbing it down. And what I did a moment ago with the sashiko, where you are laying multiple stitches in a row, that's called the sewing method. And most types of embroidery stitches can be done either way. Sometimes it's easier. I think it's easier to learn them the stabbing method, and sometimes then you figure out, oh, once I understand this, my hands are better at doing it, the stitching method. But generally, most how-to videos are going to show you the stabbing method, because it's easier to see each individual step. All right, so I've got this whole line of running stitches. They are not even or uniform, but that's okay, because I wasn't trying to. And I want to finish off. So I'm going to do one last stitch here and pull my needle through to the back of the fabric. I'm going to turn this over so I can show you how to tie off. Let's see. Still trying to figure out how I can, like, get this camera angle better. Well, anyway, so what I'm going to do is so I'm going to keep my needle threaded. I don't want to unthread it yet. I'm going to slide my needle under one of the stitches nearby. So I'm not going through the fabric. I'm sliding under the stitch. And now I have this loop on the fabric here. I'm going to take my needle and go back through that loop and pull tight. And that's the start of a knot. Right now, because my stitches are pretty far apart, it's not close enough to be a knot. So I'm going to do it one more time. I'm going to slide under that same stitch. And I've got my loop of thread. I'm going to take my needle, send it back through that stitch and pull tight. And now I've got a pretty sturdy knot. There it is. So basically I've just knotted this loose thread around another stitch. And when you are working on stitching something and you've got lots of threads on the back there, you don't have to knot it to itself. you can knot that off against anything else. So if you end up closer to some pink thread you've stitched, you can knot off on the pink thread. You don't have to necessarily tie the thread off to itself. You can tie it to anything. You're just anchoring it. You're just keeping it from unthreading later. You can snip really close there. You don't need to have a huge tail off there. And that's done. That's not going to come undone unless someone pulls at it. If you get into embroidering things like clothing or dish towels or things people are going to see the back of, you should look into some finer finishing techniques. There are ways to do it where it ends up looking almost as neat on the front as it does on the back, which is not a thing I worry about at all when I'm doing something that's just decorative. If it's just going to be seen from one side for the most part, then let that back be a mess. There can be threads everywhere. There can be lumps and bumps because if you're hanging it up against a wall or putting it in a frame, no one's going to see the back. Don't worry about it. But there are other ways to finish things a little more professionally if it's going to be something you're wearing or seeing or giving as a gift. It's up to you. And there's also the trick of just putting a piece of felt on the back of your piece so that nobody can see how messy it is. Then you've just got a lovely, lovely piece. Yeah. All right. So we have done the running stitch and we're going to build off of that. The next one I'm going to teach you is called back stitch. And I consider back stitch to be sort of the basic embroidery stitch. Running stitch is a good one to start with because it really is illustrative of how you stitch in embroidery. But a back stitch is better. Back stitch is a wonderful stitch to use for outlines, for text. Basically, I say when in doubt, do a back stitch. And I will show you why that is right now. All right, so I'm using some orange thread. I'm going to start on my second line here. I'm going to try and stay down towards the bottom because I seem to have a better grasp on the camera angle when I'm down there. So just like before, you're going to start, come from the back. When you pull your needle through, make sure you're grabbing right at the eye of the needle so you have both those tips. Pull through. You want to make sure that when you pull through far enough that your knot is right up against your fabric. You don't want to have a long tail back there because then your first stitches will be loose. So make sure that's pulled nice and taut. And just like the running stitch, we're going to just go ahead and do one stitch down. Again, I'm not going to make it tiny. So we've got our first stitch. And then again, like the running stitch, we're going to leave a little bit of a space. I'm going to leave a little space here and come up a short distance away from my first stitch. So now we've got a stitch and we've got thread coming out the front. And then this is what makes it the back stitch. Okay, here we go. This space right here where your first stitch sort of went down into the fabric, you're going to put your needle in that same hole and pull through. So that is your back stitch. It's called back stitch because it's going back. But what it does is it creates a solid line versus your dotted line on the running stitch. So then you've got your first back stitch. Again, you're going to, just sort of looking at the top here, you're going to leave a little space. Push your needle up. So you can kind of see my needle is right there. Pull it up and through. Again, pinch, pinch, so you don't unthread your needle. And then you just go through this hole where your second stitch ended. And this is where it's nice to be working with a fairly loose weave fabric because it's easy to get into that hole again. And what you can see is so on the back, you also have a solid line. It's a little bit thicker. But what we're basically doing is sort of like stitching a circle around a small place in the fabric. I don't know if that description is actually going to make things easier to understand, but we'll keep going. So again, leave a space, come up. You know, you can try to make these even, but the nice thing is since you end up with a solid line, if some of your stitches are much shorter and some are much longer, it still works out. So we're going to keep stitching. I've caught a little bit of my thread from my fabric here. Whew. That's okay. I can just pull on that. That's an example of something that can happen when you have a looser weave fabric, but that's all right. You can lose a couple strands there. All right, making sure that I am still close to here. There we go. So if I do this again, I will draw darker lines on my fabric. Maybe I'll use darker fabric too. This is like so bright. Yeah, so we're still back stitching. Come up a distance away, pull your needle through, make sure you're pinching so you don't unthread that needle, and then you find that hole and go back through. So one thing about backstitch is that it's taking up at least twice as much thread as the running stitch. So that's one thing to think about too. I didn't really talk about how much thread to put in your needle. I do have a suggestion on that. When I am cutting thread to stitch with, I will usually measure from, let's see if I can, I'll do it on the big screen here. I will hold, I'm going to do it with something that will show up against my sweater. This is not embroidery floss, but let's pretend it is. So I will hold the end of the floss in my fingertips and I will measure against my arm. So I like to measure between my fingertips and my elbow. So about that much. And then where I'm pinching with my elbow, then I can drop it with my fingertips, pick up my scissors, give that a cut. On me, that's like maybe 14, 16 inches. I would say, you know, obviously it's going to be different for everyone because everyone's got different body size, but I would say generally between 12 and 18 inches to stitch. Many things you are stitching will need more thread than that. However, when you've got a really long thread, you just have more chance that it's going to tangle up on itself while you're stitching. Because when you start out and you've got a lot of thread here and you're maneuvering it, it's pretty easy to get little knots in it, to get it caught up on other things. But when you stick between 12 and 18 inches long, 12 and 18 inches long, that tends to work out. And I am very guilty of often pulling off a longer piece of thread because I know I'm doing a bigger section, and almost every time I end up getting a knot in it. So even though it's tempting, stick with shorter thread. You may have heard the saying, long thread, lazy tailor. I think that's a rude saying, but it is accurate. All right, so I'm going to do a couple more of these back stitches and then show you again that tying off method. It'll look a little different with these back stitches. It actually works a little bit better with back stitch. And just as a general rule, I like to give myself at least 3 or 4 inches of tail to tie my knots in the back. If your thread gets really short, it gets harder to tie those knots because it has to be like at least as long as your needle and a little bit then some so that you can do the sort of loop-de-loop. So I'm going to say that this is as far as I want to go before switching thread. So now on the back of my fabric, I've got my long line of thread, and here I can just go right under the stitch I'm already doing. So go right into there. Again, make sure I leave this little loop. And so you can see that the shorter your tail is, the smaller your loop's going to be, and that can get a little challenging to get through. But I think I've just enough. So I've got my loop, I've got my tail. I'm going to go through with my needle and pull. And that actually tied a pretty good knot with just one go, which is fine. You can leave it at one, or you can be paranoid like me and do a second knot and then cut it really close. And that is the back stitch. I will show you some examples of back stitch. Let's see, what's a good one? Here is a kit we have of North Carolina. And on this one, all of the stitching, basically all of the stitching all the way around, including the lettering, is back stitch. On the letters, there's a couple of places where there's like 3 or 4 rows of back stitch next to each other, but sort of the whole thing was outlined in back stitch. And these are just some long long straight stitches. And then this is satin stitch in the middle. But yeah, backstitch is great. So it's great for lettering. Oh, I'll show you something else. This is a really gorgeous, delicate sample that was stitched up by Maria, who works here with us, among other places. And this is an embroidery design from David Eichenberger. He's a local artist, and we have 3 kits with his designs in them. They're definitely our more advanced kits. They have so many fine lines, and they're so beautiful. The nice thing is you actually don't have to stitch all of it. Like this part here is not stitched, but it still shows up because of the printed design. Anyway, this is pretty much entirely backstitched. They're very tiny stitches, but backstitch is a great thing to use when you have a really intricate design, because you don't really need to do something fancy because the design's already fancy, and it's actually going to sort of showcase the picture more when you use a simpler stitch. Also, it's just kind of easy to go backstitch. One nice thing about backstitch is that you always know where your stitch is going to end up because you've already made the space where it goes. So it's pretty easy to go along quickly with backstitch. But yeah, so here's one. That's another example of backstitch. Again, when in doubt, backstitch. Okay, so the next one we're going to do is called the stem stitch. It's called stem stitch because traditionally it's used for, oh, thank you, Erin. Yeah, that dogwood is beautiful. I think we just got out of stock, but I'm hoping to get it back in stock soon. Yeah, so stem stitch, called stem stitch because traditionally it's used to make stems on floral things, but it's a really cool texture. Let me see if I can find a stem stitch to show you. That's one. So on this sample, this blue honeycomb is stem stitch. So it sort of has this like almost wave texture, almost braided texture when you do it, but we'll do a sample so you can see how it is. This is one of the few stitches where I think it's really important to actually be consistent in your stitch size. It makes a real difference to how the stitch looks. If it gets really inconsistent, like really long, really short, not the same, it just doesn't look as pretty. So this is the only one where I really try to make my stitches the same length. Okay. So I'm going to do my third line here. Let me see if I can make this line darker so you can see it. Maybe that helped. All right. So again, I'm going to come from the back of the fabric. There we go. Up on my line, make 1 stitch. So I've got my first stitch there. Now, what you're going to do for the stem stitch is you're going to come up alongside the midpoint of that stitch. So I like to sort of put my needle here and say, okay, so I've got a little T shape. So I wanted my stitch to come up here and just right above that line of stitching. Let's see how close I can get here and still be in focus. So I'm going to come up. That's not even close enough. So close that it's like it's touching the thread, but it's not going between the threads. So this is coming up just basically just like right alongside the, oh boy, all right, the midpoint of those stitches. So you pull through, and then I'm going to make that stitch. So this is my new stitch, which starts right there. Coming forward, I'm going to make that the same length as my previous stitch and pull down. Oh, an important thing is that when I stitch now, I'm going to make sure that I'm hitting this line. That's important, and I'll talk about that in a minute. All right, so that's my second stitch. Now again, I'm going to come up. So here's my second one. It kind of starts here and ends here. I'm going to come up alongside the midpoint of that second stitch. Pull through and do a stitch forward. So making sure to hit that design line each time. That's important because what you are doing is, in effect, each stitch is ever so slightly diagonal because you're starting it just above the design line and you're ending it on the line. And by design line, I just mean whatever line is there that you're stitching over. This one for me is really hard to do without lines. So if I'm stitching like just freehand, I do not do a very good job with stem stitch. I need to have the guidance there. But as you go along, you'll see, so you're coming up alongside, going down forward. Let me do a few more. It usually takes for me like 5 or 6 stitches to really start to see that texture come through. Another thing that's important is I am always coming up on the same side for each stitch. So for me, this is the left-hand side. I'm not going to try and translate that to what you're seeing in this mirror video, but I'm always coming up on top. You can either start on the top or on the bottom, but to do this particular texture, you want to keep it consistent, always come up to the same side. And if you go on the internet and go looking for different types of embroidery stitches, of which you will find thousands and thousands, and it's kind of fun. There's all sorts of different ways to do things, but you will find variations. So you'll find variations on the stem stitch where it switches back and forth, where it starts on one side or the other. But I think to get the effect that really looks different than other types of stitches, staying consistent to one side and to one size really is the trick. So let's see, I think I've got enough stitches on here now that you can kind of see that texture, and hopefully if you're stitching at home, you can kind of see that texture going along too. But I just think it's kind of pretty. It's just a little bit different than back stitch. It's still sort of a solid line. And this works really well on curves also. So it's also good for text. And of course you can use it for stems and things. You can also use it if you want like a slightly thicker line. So like I could do the back stitch here, but then when you look at the stem stitch, it's just almost like a heavier stroke than the back stitch. So I'm going to stop that there because I've got 2 more stitches to go. And I said I'd go for an hour, but I'll go over. What else am I doing? You know, quarantine. Woo! Oh, hey, Mom. I'm glad that the stem stitch is working better for you. It's one that's really easy. One thing that's easy to do by accident is to be too far away from your stitch. I don't know if I'm going to get this close enough to show you, but basically, like, if you come up and your needle is not brushing up against those threads, then you're too far and you're going to have a very different looking stitch. All right, so we're going to tie this off. I'm going to show you another method to tie off. So let's say that you were working on something and you got down to this much thread because you were really trying to finish without changing your thread. I don't know who does that. But anyway, so when you have this small amount of thread, it's obviously not enough to like use your needle to do that other tying off method, but you can do this. You can do this if you have multiple strands. So you have to have at least 2 strands in your needle to do this, but you can take it and separate those strands. It's going to take me a moment. So kind of half and half. I've got 3 and 3, but you could do 2 and 4, whatever. And then you're just going to tie them in a knot together, sort of like tying a shoelace. And this is about as small as it can be for me and my fingers to tie this knot. Is this showing up on your screen? There we go. So you just take it, tie a knot, and pull that tight. I usually do a couple here. I'll do as many as I can. But when you tie that knot there, it's got to be big enough that it won't pop back through the front of the fabric. But that is another way to secure your threads, which is particularly helpful when you've gotten down to the point where your tail is too short to practically do the other style. But then this too, you can go in and clip these close. And this is where these scissors come in great. These scissors are so sharp at the tip. A lot of times scissors, like, you can't use the very, very tip to cut, but these you can, and they can get really close and cut all your threads off. There we go. Okay. Oh, I have been telling you how hard embroidery needles are for a long time. Let's hide that one. Okay. All right. Next up, we're going to do this split stitch. I like to do it in this order because the split stitch is almost exactly the same as the stem stitch, only instead of coming up next to your threads, you come up right in the middle. So let me grab some thread. Oh, here we go. You can watch me thread a needle real time. See if I am as good as I claim. I'm going to use, this is a size 5 needle. I usually use a size 5 or a size 7. So here we go. I'm going to do my method. So I've got this thread pinched really tight. You can like barely see it come up between my fingers. I'm going to take my needle and, okay, where can I go? There we go. Lower my needle down over the thread. It's just going to get through. Woo. All right, so I lost 2 threads on the side, but you know what? That's okay. I'm just going to take those off. I'm not going to worry about it. I'll try and squish those down the inchworm method so they don't tie into a knot. Ah, it worked. Okay. So I've got some dark purple here. We're going to do a split stitch. So split stitch, you do need to make sure you have multiple threads. I've got 4 now, so it'll work. I wouldn't do it with less than 4. I mean, you could do it with 2. It's going to look, well, it could be interesting. Try it. Try whatever you want. That's the point of embroidery. You can just mess around and improvise and come up with cool things. All right, so again, as we've been doing, start from the back, pull up, make sure your knot is tight against the back, make your first stitch, and then this time, like before, we're going to kind of find the midpoint where it crosses as a T, but this time you're coming up on the line and you're trying to come up right in between. Well, let's see. Maybe if I angle this. So I'm coming up right in between my threads. Let me do a few of these. So that's 2. So then you're going to come up again in the midpoint of your second stitch. And because these stitches are overlapping, the midpoint of your second stitch is actually going to be really close to the end point of your first stitch. If that helps you with visualizing it, I hope so. Yeah, I like stem stitch a lot. I think it comes out really pretty. And then split stitch is a little bit harder because you're trying to get up between those threads. And if you could see what was happening there, I'm sort of like poking and pulling back and poking till I get to the right place. And I'm not worried about splitting it evenly. Like right now, I think I have 1 thread over here and 3 threads over there, but that's okay. It's still split. And this one, split stitch is really fun to do different size stitches. You know, if you do really small, close together stitches, it's going to have a very different texture than when you do larger spaced out stitches. You can switch it up. This is one that's really like, you can play with it. Sometimes it'll look like braids. Sometimes it'll look like a chain. There's a lot to do with it. It's a lot of times people use it when they want to do outlines that are a little bit soft or fuzzy, because it ends up, you know, still a fairly straight line and still a kind of unbroken line like our back stitch and our stem stitch, but just has kind of like softer edges. I am sort of regretting not getting all 6 strands in here, but no, you know what, I'm going to say I'm glad I'm doing it this way so I can show you that, yes, you don't have to get all 6 strands through to do the split stitch. It's a little harder because I've got fewer strands to work with, kind of got smaller real estate that I'm trying to get through, but it can be done. All right, I'm going to do like 2 more split stitches, and then the last one I'm going to show you today is called the chain stitch, and I like it a lot. It looks very complicated, but it is not that complicated, which is one of the reasons that I love it. Okay, last stem split stitch. Split stitch. There we go. I did not want to split, but I got it. All right, so then I'm just going to end that with a little straight stitch down there. Flip it over, and I'm going to do, so I've got plenty of thread. I'm going to do my regular tying off. I'm going to go under a recent stitch or a close by stitch. I'm going to go through this loop, and I'm going to go through that loop again before I pull it tight. And that's going to make a satisfactory knot. Yep, so that's knotted there. And I'll show you something too while we're here and I've got some extra thread. If you do not want to tie knots on the back for whatever reason, you can, if you have enough thread, you can weave your ends back through. So instead of, so pretend there's no knot there, what I could do is I could still, on the back of my fabric, go under that stitch, and I can go under this stitch. And again, I'm not going through the fabric, I'm just going under the stitches. And if you weave that end through, maybe about, that's like an inch or so, a couple of like centimeter and a half. If you weave it through far enough, you can cut it down and it's going to stay there, especially on something like this where, you know, or like something you're just going to hang on the wall. No one's going to touch the back of it. That's not going to be a problem. If this is something you're going to end up washing or wearing, then the weaving through technique will weave a lot farther and you still kind of have the chance that it's going to come unwoven. But if it's just something that is not going to get a lot of wear and tear, you can weave those ends through and nothing's going to make them come undone except touching it. So that's one way. So again, sometimes what people do when they start, I know I told you that you don't have to start with a knot. So sometimes you'll start and leave a long tail and then come back later and weave it through. But that's like a whole extra step. So, you know, if that's what you want to do, try it out, but it is not required. Okay, moving on to chain stitch. Let me find a good sample. All right. So here's another North Carolina themed kit. We actually don't have this anymore. This was one we did like 3 years ago, long time ago. But I have stitched the outline of the state in chain stitch. And I think it's pretty cool. It's got a nice texture to it. It's a stitch that covers a lot of territory. So if you have a design with thick lines on it, chain stitch is pretty good at covering those up. And if you want to know, these lettering is all back stitch. It's just a couple different layers of back stitch in different colors. Okay, so this is how we chain stitch. And technically this is called like a reverse chain stitch, but we're just going to call it chain stitch. If you go looking online, you will find other ways to do chain stitch. I think this is the easiest way to teach it and learn it. You may eventually decide the other way is easier to actually stitch, but this is the way we're going to do it. Okay, so again, similar to what we've been doing, we're going to start from the back, come up on our line, and this time, instead of making sort of a large initial stitch, we're going to do what I call a tiny tack, which is just another straight stitch. It's just small, a tiny tack. So a little small stitch right there. It needs to be wide enough that you can put your needle under it later. So don't make it too tiny, but think about your needle. As long as your needle will fit behind it, you're good. So a tiny tack to start with. And then, similar to back stitch, we're going to leave a space and come up on our line a little distance away from that tiny tack we made. All right, so here's our first chain. We're going to take the needle, slide it under that tiny tack, pull it through, and here, when you pull through, be a little gentle. You know, pull it all the way, but like, don't yank it tight. You want to pull it so it's got a little bit of curve to that thread. And now, again, like back stitch, we're going to go put your needle through the hole that you just came out of. So where that sort of curve starts, right there, we're going to go back through that. And again, when you pull this, just kind of gentle, just be gentle. If you pull really tight, your chain will sort of be long and skinny, but when you leave some looseness there, you get a little circle. So that's our first chain. We anchored it with a tiny tack. From now on, we don't need any more tiny tacks, just that one at the very beginning, just to start. So now what we're going to do is, again, leave a space, come up through here, and then this time, we don't have a tack, but we have this whole loop. So we're going to lay our needle down and go behind both parts of that loop, pull through, give it a little bit of a curve, and then back through the hole down there. And pull. So now we've got 2 chains. And you can go through, so what I'm doing right now is I'm just sort of using my needle to kind of give them a little bit of space back. Each time you do a stitch, it's going to put a little tension on the one before it. So eventually you just sort of get to where your hands understand what to do. But for now, you can always go back and kind of just like mess with those. And then the next chain, the next link in the chain is going to be the same way. Come through, go behind your 2 loops, back down through the same hole. Now I've got 3 chains. This is another one that it's really fun to play around with how far apart your stitches are, how big your loops are. It's a chain stitch, so think about other chains you've seen, whether it's necklace chains or hardware chains. They're all different shapes and sizes. Sometimes some will have a couple of tiny links. You can do a pattern. You can do something like big, small, big, small. On the sample I showed you before, these are all pretty small. It's pretty small and tight together, which gives it that braided look. This is a much looser chain, but these are 2. I did them the same steps, the same exact steps, got those 2 different results, which is another thing that I got kind of a mess back here, but that's okay. It can be a mess on the back. But yeah, one thing I really love about embroidery is that even within the same exact set of steps, the amount of tension you put on and the amount of spacing you use can make it look like an entirely different stitch, which I think is cool. If you can have something that like works for a bunch of different textures and effects, that's good. I like multi-use things. So here I'm doing a couple smaller chains, then maybe I'll do another big one. Like I said, after that first tiny tack, you don't need tacks anymore. You're just anchoring each chain link to the link that came before it. I'm going to do one more stitch and show you something that I think is interesting. Okay, when you flip to the back, oh, well, mine's a mess. When you flip to the back, what you usually see, we're just going to look at this part here, is interestingly, it's basically a straight line of stitches. Basically what you've got back here is just where you're jumping from each chain to each chain. So that's kind of cool that like all this texture on the front and you just have kind of a straight line on the back. And that also means that it's really easy to tie off. So when you've done enough chains, when you feel like your chain is finished, you don't have to do anything special. You don't need to do another little tack or anything like that. You can, if you want to visually have a tack at the beginning and the end, you can. But I think that like that tack at the beginning, no one's going to see it except you. You know, it's pretty small. People aren't going to look for it. Anyway, so I've done another chain, a loop in the chain. And all I'm going to do to tie it off is my same method. I can go under a stitch back there, through my loop, and pull. I'm going to be a little more gentle when I pull this one because I don't want my whole chain to tighten up. So I'm just going to sort of, I'm putting a hand here, a finger here. That's going to keep these other stitches from getting any tension on them. There's still that last stitch, but I'm just going to gently tug. And there we go. That didn't pull anything too much. And then again, I'm going to use my really great snippy little scissors, cut close to the edge. And I've still got some thread that I could do something else with. So that is what I usually go over in our introduction to embroidery class. We tend to do a different kind of design each time. This little bee was one of our designs. We've done flowers, we've done other things. Anything I can do that just sort of showcases the different types of stitches. So what we did today, to review, this is the running stitch. It's a dotted line. You can make the stitches as big as you want, as far apart as you want. You can change it up. You can make a consistent dotted line. This is backstitch. Backstitch is wonderful. It is sort of what you can use whenever you're not sure what else to use. Each stitch lands in the same place the previous stitch started. Yeah. Well, anyway, it connects, so you get a solid line. This one is the stem stitch. This is one where each stitch starts just slightly above the previous one, and you get little tiny, ever so very small diagonal lines. That's the stem stitch. Then we had split stitch, which is similar to stem, except you come up in the middle of your threads, and you get this sort of braidy texture. And then there is the chain stitch, which is one of my favorites, especially because it looks so complicated and it really isn't. And it fills up a lot of French. Oh, Karen, asking for French knots. I will do some French knots. They are so hard to teach, but I'm going to do them. We'll see if we can do it with this video set up here. Yeah, I try to avoid French knots at all times. Thank you, Joanna and Erin. Thank you for following along with us. I hope that you get really stitchy, and if you make anything, I hope you post it and tag it so I can see it. I love to see what people do. All right, so I'm going to attempt teaching the French knot. All right, so I have my thread. I've got a knot in the end coming up. Okay, how am I going to do this so you can see it? Thank you, Ruth Ann. Thank you for coming in. Oh, I should give my final banner. Aha. There we go. So, okay, Mom, I'll show you French knots at home. And actually, you know what? My little slider down here, I think that I do have a video on how to do French knots on our website. So we've got a little how-to videos section, and I've got a lot of these stitches on there. I think there's like 5 or 6 videos, and they each do 2 stitches. No, I don't think I have French knot on there. But you can find some videos on French knots if you love them. But yes, so thank you for joining for the first live interactive crafting event. Figuring out the software. I think honestly this is pretty good except the lighting, and also I don't know where the camera is, and I will learn that over time. So this was a embroidery primer. Tomorrow I'll be live making beeswax food wraps, which is actually a lot simpler than embroidery, but it takes more equipment. So we have kits for that. You can follow along with us. Other embroidery stuff I should tell you. We sell all these supplies on our website. We sell needles, thread, hoops. We also sell lots of kits. We have these cute tiny kits that make little 3-inch ornaments. These are great because you can finish them in a quick sitting. This one is bananas, and I love it. And then if you want a longer term project, we do have our bigger kits that make a 7-inch hoop. This one I feel is very good for our current times. Thank you, Carla. Thank you for tuning in. Yeah, so we've got lots of embroidery stuff. You can find our videos online. Thanks, Erin. Yeah, and I hope you'll craft with us again soon. We've got an a jewelry repair class coming up on Wednesday with Cynthia, who is our fairy craft mother and jewelry professional. And then we've got some more stuff in the works that we will announce. Yeah, I hope you're all staying safe and staying busy. Thank you, Olivia. Thank you, Katie. I'm so glad people watched. I didn't know what was going to happen today. All right, so I think I'm going to close this down. Do I have any more fun banners? Yeah, there we go. Thank you, Megan. All right, guys, good luck. And if you want to like email questions to me or put questions in the event comments, you could do that too. I'll try and follow up. I love sharing whatever embroidery knowledge I can. Okay, all right, bye.